We continue now at the top of Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Aleph Meseches Bava Metzia. This is Bava Metzia Daf 101a. And the previous summit, the Mishnah said that if a person sells olive trees to a buyer, and the idea is that the buyer is going to cut down the trees and use the wood, but the buyer does not cut the trees right away, and the olive trees produce olives, so then it depends. If it's a lower quality set of olives, so then the buyer is allowed to keep those olives, but if it's higher quality olives, then they split the olives. It's split between the buyer and the seller. And the Mishnah said what's considered to be higher quality olives, that's if they produce a revius of oil for every saw of olives, which is a quarter lug of oil for every saw of olives. And now Reish Lakish says that when we count the revius, that has to be chutz min ha'otzah. That does not count the processing, meaning after you take off the processing, then it has to produce a revius. That's considered higher quality olives. Rashi says chutz min ha'otzah shu motzi, meaning with the exception, you have to subtract what he spends b'misikasun uvatzirasan, when he's harvesting and when he's pressing the olives, you subtract that, and if after you deduct that, then you have a revius of oil, so then you have higher quality olives, which are split between the buyer and the seller. And the Gemara continues at the two dots, Shataf Nahar Zesav, if the river sweeps away his olive trees and they take root in another field, so the owner of the first field says that it's his trees that are producing the olives, he should get the olives. The owner of the second field is saying that it's his earth that's helping to produce the olives, so he should get the olives, and the Mishnah said that they split the olives. And the Gemara says, Amar Ula, Amar Reish Lakish, Ula says that Reish Lakish says, Lo Shanu Ela Shenakru B'Gushein. The case over here in the Mishnah is specifically when the earth also is uprooted, Ula Achar Shalosh, and we're talking after 3 years. Aval B'Soch Shalosh, but if it's within the first 3 years, Hakol Shel Bal HaZesim, then everything goes to the owner of the olive trees. D'Yamar Le, because the owner of the olive trees can say to the owner of the second field, Iyad Natat B'Soch Shalosh, had you planted within 3 years, Mi Hava Achalt, would you have eaten anything? Meaning to say there's a prohibition of Arla, and therefore the only reason that prohibition is being avoided is really because it's coming from my trees which were already planted previously, and therefore he is entitled. And Rashi explains, Shenakru B'Gushein, the case over here is uprooted with the clod of earth, meaning Im HaKarka Shesvivosein, meaning the trees are uprooted together with the earth that is surrounding them, Sheyacholun Lichios Al Yadu. The point over here is that earth that it's uprooted with is enough that it could actually live through that earth. It doesn't need to be replanted. So then in that situation, the halacha happens to be Petur and Min Ha'Orla. The halacha happens to be that any olives that grow are exempt from Orla because it's considered still growing from the same earth that it's been growing from all along. Kedetanan, as we learned in the Mishnah in Orla, Elon Shenekar V'Hasela Imo, if you have a tree that's uprooted and the rock is uprooted, the earth is uprooted together with it, Im Yachol Lichios Pater, so if the tree is able to live with that earth, so then it's Pater from Orla. But if not Chayev, if not, then it's going to be Chayev in Orla. So we're talking about that situation, Ula Achar Shalosh, and then it takes root in the second field, and then 3 years pass. Now olives are growing, those olives are split. Kilomar afilu nekru begushein, meaning even if it was uprooted with the clod of earth, lo shanu diachloko ela la'achar shalosh. We only say they split the olives after 3 years, la'achar shalosh shanim, after 3 years, sheshat for hanar, meaning 3 years from when the river swept it away. She'ilu notan mitchila bal hakarka below gushein, because let's say the owner of this second field, let's say he planted it without that clod of earth, kvar yotzu achshav michlal ha'orla. Then after 3 years, it's no longer orla, he'd be entitled. Tahashta lo mahani le gushin the fact that there's a clod of earth of the owner of the trees doesn't do anything after 3 years. But within the first 3 years, Gushin Debal Hazeisim, Hu de Kasharilu. It's the fact that there's the clod of earth of the owner of the trees that's allowing this fruit. That's why it's not a problem of Orla, V'Hakol Shalo, and that's why in the first 3 years it all belongs to him. But the Gemara continues, V'lei Molei, let the owner of the land say to the owner of the trees, Ianon Noti, had I planted new trees, let's say I got rid of your trees and planted my own, Liachar after 3 years I would have eaten everything. Hashta tochal palga bahadoy, and now you're going to eat half together with me, so therefore this is problematic to say that besoch shalosh everything goes to the owner of the trees, and after shalosh he's only going to get half of it. Again, the person can argue, had I gotten rid of your trees and planted my own trees, I would have gotten everything after 3 years. And so the Gemara instead says, Ella rather, Kiyasa Ravin Am Reish Lakish, when Ravin came, he said that Reish Lakish said, Lo shanu ela shenekru begushein. The case of the Mishnah again is when the trees got uprooted with the clod of earth that surrounded them. Uvisoch shalosh, and on the contrary, we're talking about besoch shalosh during the first 3 years that they actually split the olives. Aval yachar shalosh, but after 3 years, hakol leval karka, everything goes to the owner of the land. Diyomar le, because the owner of the land can say to the owner of the trees, Ianon noti lachar shalosh, mi lo hava achilna lekule, had I planted it, so after 3 years, let's say I got rid of your trees and planted my own trees, after 3 years, I would have gotten everything, so therefore I'm entitled to everything after 3 years. They're only splitting the first 3 years. But the Gemara continues, V'lei molei, but why doesn't the owner of the trees say back to the owner of the second field, Iad notat besoch shalosh lo hava achalt, had you planted new trees, the first 3 years you would have gotten nothing. Hashta tochal palga b'hadoy, but now you're eating half of it together with me. Why are you entitled to half of the produce of the first 3 years? Had you gotten rid of my trees, you would have had nothing if you planted your own trees. And the Gemara says to that, Mishum Damar Le, it's because the owner of the land can say to him, Ianon noti have ketini. Had I planted it, they would have been thin trees, they would have been small trees. Vizarana techusayu, and I could have planted underneath that silka v'yarka. I could have planted beets and vegetables underneath. And so therefore I did take some loss by allowing your trees to stay there, and I am entitled to half. And Rashi explains, have ketini, they would have been saplings, have zesim dakin, they would have been thin olive trees, v'lohayel hensel, there wouldn't have been any shade, v'zarana tusayu, silka v'yarka, I could have planted underneath there beets and vegetables. So then again, by keeping your trees there, I did take some loss, so I'm entitled to half the fruits. And the Gemara continues, Tana, we learned in a Braisa, Amar halo zeisai ani nota, let's say the owner of the trees says to the owner of the second field where the trees took root, I want to take back my olive trees, I'm going to uproot them and bring them back to my field. Ein shomin lo, we don't listen to him. And the Gemara says, my time, what's the reason? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, Mishum Yishuv Eretz Yisrael, it's because of settling Eretz Yisrael, it's improper to uproot trees. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Kagon da, for reasoning like this, Tzricha Rabbah needs a great individual to explain it. And Rashi explains, Tzricha Rabbah, Shimlo Persha Rabbi Yochanan, had Rabbi Yochanan not explained the reason, Lo hayinu omer mosab misvara, we would not have known that out of logic. It needs Rabbi Yochanan, this kind of halacha needs Rabbi Yochanan to explain the reason. And the Gemara continues, Tanan Hasan, we learned in a Mishnah over there, this is a Mishnah in Meseches Demai, Rabbi Yehuda says, HaMekabel stei avosav min anochri, if somebody is a sharecropper in a field of Eretz Yisrael, that's what we think stei avosav means right now, it just means that the field is in Eretz Yisrael, so he's a sharecropper in this field, and the non-Jew is the owner of the field, so the Mishnah says, Ma'aser, first he has to separate Meiser, v'nosein lo, and then he gives the non-Jew his portion, and he takes his own portion, he's a sharecropper, so essentially he is taking a certain portion of the produce for himself, and the rest goes to the non-Jew. And the Gemara explains, Savruha, right now we think, Mai stei avosav. What does the term stei avosav mean in the Mishnah? It just means Eretz Yisrael, it just means a field that's in Eretz Yisrael. V'amai karu lo stei avosav, why is that referred to as stei avosav? It means Sada Avraham Yitzchak v'Yakov. It means the field of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Again, it just means a field in Eretz Yisrael. V'kasavar, and we think that the Tana this Mishnah holds, Ein kinyan l'nochri, be'eretz Yisrael, la'afkia miyad meiser. There is no real kinyan for a non-Jew in Eretz Yisrael to uproot the obligation of meiser, meaning even though this field belongs to a non-Jew, but still, the produce from this field is still obligated in meiser. And furthermore, makabel kechocher dami, a makabel, which means to say a sharecropper, is really like a chocher, which is a tenant farmer. A chocher is somebody, he's not giving a certain percentage, or he's not taking a certain percentage of the produce for himself and giving the rest to the non-Jew or to the owner, but a chocher is somebody who says, I'm going to give you no matter what, I'm going to give you a certain amount of produce, whether this field produces or not, and then I will take whatever this field produces. So right now we think a makabel has the same status as a chocher, and ma chocher, just like when it comes to a chocher, when it comes to this tenant farmer, bein avad uvein lo avad bo yisurei umeitan le. The halach is whether it produces, whether it doesn't produce, he has to take off meiser, and then he gives it to him, because it's really the equivalent of paying off a debt. It's like you're paying off an obligation. So af makabel nami, we think that's true also by a makabel, by a sharecropper, ki poreya chovaso dami, it's the equivalent of paying off his debt, and therefore ma'aser v'nosein lo, therefore he takes off meiser, and then he gives to him. And Rashi explains, hamakabel lemechse, if somebody's a sharecropper and he gets 50% of the produce and the other 50% goes to the non-Jew, ma'aser techilo kol atvu, first he has to take off meiser on all of the grain, v'achar kach nosein lo lenachri chalko, then he gives the non-Jew his portion, his 50%, v'nimsa ma'aser mishalo al shal nachri, it comes out that that he's taking off Meiser from his own produce on the portion of the non-Jew, Mafsid, and the Jew is losing in this fashion when he separates Meiser in this way. And so the Gemara said, we assume right now that Mekabel is Lemechza. If somebody is a sharecropper for 50%, it's Kechocher Dami. He's like a tenant farmer, meaning Ki'ilu Mekabla V'kach V'kach Kurin L'shana. It's as if he's saying, I'm going to give you a certain amount of Kurin per year, no matter what, Beinoso, Ve'neinosa, whether it produces or whether it does not produce. And the idea over here is that if we consider a mekabel like a chocher, so then the entire field is considered to be in the reshus of the Jew. He just owes a certain amount to the non-Jew, and therefore, since the entire field is in his reshus, he has to take off meiser on the entire field, even the portion, so to speak, of the non-Jew. And the Gemara continues, Amar le Rav Kahana le Rav Papi. Rav Kahana said to Rav Papi, V'yamri lo le Rav Zavid, and some say that he said to Rav Zavid, Elahad Tanya, but what about what we learned in the following brisa? This is essentially just a slightly different version of the Mishnah above, of Rabbi Yehuda's opinion. The brisa has it as follows, Rabbi Yehuda, Omer Rabbi Yehuda says, HaMekabel stei avosav, somebody is a sharecropper on stei avosav, mimetzik nachri, from a non-Jew who is oppressive, ma'aser v'nosin lo, again the same halach, he takes off meiser, and then he gives the non-Jew his portion. So this is the same as the Mishnah above, but it adds in that he's a meitzik nachri. And so the Gemara says, "My ir ya meitzik." Why do we have to deal with a meitzik, with an oppressive non-Jew? Afilu ein meitzik nami. The same halacha should be true if he's not oppressive. The way we understood the Mishnah before was that the non-Jew was the legitimate owner of the field, and that this is the halacha ma'aser v'nosein lo. And so the Gemara says we have to revise our understanding of Rabbi Yehuda's halacha as follows: El liolam yesh kinyan lenachri be'eretz Yisrael la'afkia miyad meiser. You have to say that really there is a kinyan for non-Jews in Eretz Yisrael to undo the obligations of Meiser. Umekabel lav kechocher dami, and furthermore, a Mekabel, somebody who's a sharecropper, is not the same as a tenant farmer. It's not like the Jew has full possession over the field and he just owes a certain debt to the non-Jew, but rather we're talking about a situation where the non-Jew really does have ownership over the field. And so how do we understand this halacha? Umay stei avosav, what does it mean that it was a field of his father's? Stei avosav mamish. It means to say that it really was the field of his father's. And the idea over here is that we're imposing a certain knas in this situation. Really, he doesn't really need to take off meiser on the non-Jew's portion because it belongs to the non-Jew. We say yesh kinyan lenachri be'eretz Yisrael hafgia miyad meiser. We say that a mekabel is lav kechocher dami. There's no real obligation to take off meiser. It's just a knas. And the Gemara explains uledidehu dekansur rabbanan, to him, meaning because of the fact that this field belonged to his ancestors at one point in time, and it was taken away, so we impose a fine upon him that he has to give this meiser. Because since this field is so beloved to him, so he's willing to be a sharecropper for this field under these conditions. But another person we wouldn't impose such a fine. And the Gemara says further, now by him, my time a konsur rabbanan. What's the reason that we're imposing this fine? What's the reason for the knas? Amar Rabbi Yochanan says, the reason why we impose this fine is we want to encourage him to reacquire this field from the non-Jew who took it away in a coercive fashion. That's the idea, that this is an oppressive non-Jew. And the Gemara says, Amar Rabbi Yirmiyah says, Kigon da, for an explanation like this, Tzricha Rabba needs a great individual to explain this halacha. And Rashi explains, Meitzik Anas, it means he's a coercive non-Jew. That means to say that he took the property unjustly. It really doesn't belong to the non-Jew. He took it by force. And then the Gemara said, really, there's no meiser obligation because yesh kinyan, because when the non-Jew has a kinyan in Eretz Yisrael, it undoes the meiser obligation. And the way Rashi understands the Gemara is v'inami ein kinyan. Now, even if we say there is no kinyan for a non-Jew to undo the obligation, so let's say this field, technically speaking, has an obligation in meiser, but still, mekabel lav kechocher dami, but a sharecropper is not the same as a tenant farmer. Ve'in mutal olav liftor chelko shel nachri, so he doesn't have to take care of the portion of the non-Jew, meaning to say, even if you're going to say that technically there's an obligation on the field to be ma'aser, the field to take off meiser, but this Jew is not responsible for the non-Jew's portion anyhow. The lo poreach chovaso, he's not paying off a debt to the non-Jew as if he has reshus over the whole field. Shebereshus hanachri gadol, really this was in the reshus, it was in the possession of the non-Jew that the produce grew, and the Jew is really not responsible to take off meiser on this portion that belongs to the non-Jew. And stay avos of mamish, but what we're talking about over here is it was a field that actually did belong to his father. fathers. V'hanachri gozla mehem, and the situation was that the non-Jew stole the field from them. So l'didehu de kansu rabbanan, so the rabbanan impose a fine upon this person to kimlan begava, because he really wants this field. The idea de chaviv olei, since it's beloved to him, lo mimna bahachi, he's not going to refrain from being a sharecropper when he has to take off meiser in this fashion, because he really wants this field. The lo mimna bahachi milakavlo lemechsa, he's not going to refrain from being a sharecropper for 50%. Utfei al shar arisin es ha-meiser hazeh mekabelei, and then he's going to have to pay more than most sharecroppers because he's going to have to take the meiser as well. He's not going to refrain because this was the field of his ancestors. Avolinish dialma, but another person, he rumbus alayla sura, if you would say that he has to take off meiser, lo mekabelo, he would never become a sharecropper for this field. So lo kansu rabbanan, so the rabbanan didn't impose the fine. Ulididei my time kansu, now with him, with regards to this person, why did they even fine him? Ma chota shekansu, what sin did he commit that they fined him? That's kedei shetei bora biyado, means to say sheyachzor v'yiknena, we want him to be encouraged to rebuy this field. Mitoch sheyiksha olav ha-meiser, because it's so hard now to separate meiser, he's really losing on this field. So yitrach v'yosef hadam v'yasalik ha-nachri mimena, he's going to make the effort to add money and get the nachri, get the non-Jew off the field. Bora means to say beruru muchsekes, this is something that's in his possession. We want him to take possession of the field. To encourage him to do that, we give him this unfavorable situation where he has to take off meiser on the non-Jew's portion. That will encourage him to take back the field. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following machlokes amoroim, hayored l'soch sadeh chaveiro, if somebody goes into the field of his friend, v'nata shelo b'rishos, and he plants trees there without permission. Amar Rav says, shaman lo, we evaluate, v'yado ala tachtona, and he has the lower hand, meaning to say, in such a situation, the person who owns the field does have to pay the person who planted the trees, but it's yado ala tachtona, he always pays the lesser amount. We evaluate what the expenses are, and we evaluate what the improvements are to the field, and the owner of the field always pays the lesser amount. Ushmuel Amar, and Shmuel says, Omden kama adam rotzalite, and we evaluate how much would a person want to pay, besada zula nota, for somebody to plant this field, meaning essentially, Shmuel says you have to pay the regular wage that you would pay someone to plant your field. And the Gemara continues, Amar Papa says, Velo pligi, they're not really arguing. Rav and Shmuel are not actually arguing. Kan besadu ha'asuyalita, in one case we're talking about a field that normally is planted with trees, and that's where Shmuel would say you have to pay the normal wage that you would pay someone to plant that field. And kan besadu she'ena asuyalita, Rav is talking about a situation where it's a field that's not normally planted, and so therefore the person would have done something else with the field. He doesn't have to pay the wages that he would have normally paid someone to plant in that field if that's not normal for this particular field. So again, he just pays the lesser amount of either the expenses or the improvement. And Rashi explains, V'nata ilanos, again he planted trees, Yado ala tachtona, so according to Rav, the person has the lower hand, meaning to say, Hashevach yeser al hotzah, if the improvement is more than what was spent, yesh lahotzah, so then the owner of the field just pays what was spent, always the lesser amount. Vim hotzah yeser al hashevach, if the amount that was spent was more than the improvement, ein lo al hashevach, he only gets the improvement. And then we said it depends what kind of field. Besadu ha'asuya linota, if it's a field that normally is planted, ilanos, meaning it's normally planted with trees, sheyafa le'ilan yoser mizra, meaning this field is better to plant trees than let's say to plant seeds. So then East of the Shmuel, so then we hold like Shmuel, again you have to pay the normal amount that a person would pay to plant this particular field. And the Gemara continues, V'had Rav, and this ruling of Rav that we do this evaluation and he has the lower hand, lav beferish itmar, it wasn't stated explicitly, ela michlole itmar, it's something we can infer from the following episode. There was a person who came before Rav, he said to him, Zil Shumla, you have to do this evaluation, meaning it was exactly this case. The person planted trees in the other individual's field, and he said you have to make an evaluation and pay him. Amar le lo beina, he said, what do you mean I have to pay him? I don't need these trees. I don't want to pay him anything. Amar le, so Rav said to him, Zil Shumle v'yadu ala tachtona. Well, you have to do the evaluation, but again, he's going to have the lower hand. You'll pay him the lesser amount. The person still refused. Amar le said to him, Lo beina, no, I don't want these trees. Why should I pay for it? L'sof chazia de godra v'kaminterla. But in the end, he saw that this person fenced in the field. He was protecting these trees. Amar le said to him, Golas adaitach denichalach. Now you've showed that you actually do want this. Zil Shumle v'yadu al helyoni. You have to do the evaluation, and now he has the upper hand. You have to pay him the higher amount. Rashi explains, Lo ba'ina eini chafetz b'netiyasa sadalavin haisali. Says, I don't want it. This was not a field that I was going to use for trees. I didn't want these trees. Golis hadaitach denichalach. But then when he protected the field, you're showing that you like it. V'yasisa sadu hasuyelita. You just turned it into a field that is planted with trees. V'yadu al halyonahu keshar shisleoir kaminak hamadina. Now he has the upper hand, and you should pay him the way Rashi understands, like you would pay a normal worker in this locale, in this particular situation. And the Gemara continues, Itmar, it was stated the following, Machlokas Amoroim, Hayorid Laso Chorvaso Shal Chaver. What if a person goes to the ruin of his friend, Uvana Shalo Bershus, when he builds a house there without the person's permission, V'yamarlo, and then later he says to him, Eitzai va'avnai ani notel, I want to take back my wood and my stones, I basically want to destroy what I just built on your property. Rav Nachman Amar Shoman Lo, Rav Nachman says, we listen to him, he can take it back. Rav Shesha Samar Ein Shoman Lo, Rav Shesha said, we don't listen to him, he cannot take it back. Meisvei, we have the following question. Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, Beis Shammai Omrim Shomin Lo, that Beis Shammai say that we listen to him, he can take it back. Or Beis Hillel Omer Mein Shomin Lo, and Beis Hillel say we don't listen to him, he cannot take it back. And this is a question on Rav Nachman. Lema Rav Nachman, the Omer ke Beis Shammai. Is Rav Nachman going like Beis Shammai? Rav Nachman said Shomin Lo, and Beis Shammai here is the one that said Shomin Lo. And the Gemara answers, Hu Damar ki Haitana Detanya. Rav Nachman will follow the author the following brisa. The brisa says Shomin Lo Divrei Rav Shimon ben Elazar. That Rav Shimon ben Elazar says it's not a machlokas Beis Shammai Beis Hillel. The halach is Shomin Lo. We do listen to him, he can take it back. And again, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel Omer, Rav Shimon ben Gamliel says, like we said above, that it's a machlokas Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel. Beis Shammai Omrim Shomin Lo. Beis Shammai say we listen to him. Beis Hillel Omrim Ein Shomin Lo. Beis Hillel say we don't listen to him. And Rashi explains Hu Damar, meaning Rav Nachman says Ki Haitana, like the following brisa, Damar Lo Nechliku Beis Hillel B'Davar Rav Shimon ben Elazar, meaning Rav Shimon ben Elazar says that Beis Hillel doesn't argue on Beis Shammai in this regard, and that's again what Rav Nachman will follow. And the Gemara continues, My Havalo, what is the final ruling on this? Amar Rav Yaakov, Amar Rav Yochanan. Rav Yaakov says that Rav Yochanan says, and we will continue with this discussion in the next video on Daf Kuf Aleph Amud Beis.